So, Sam, I want people to know who you are and how you came to be a person who would be in Minneapolis doing what you're doing. Can you take us back to your practice? Lev has told me a little bit
Sure.
about it. But
Yeah, I'm from New York originally. I was born in New York City, grew up around there and in the city. Um, my both sides of my family, our entire understanding of the American project is, immigrant New York and generally Lower Manhattan and Queens and Brooklyn as things progressed. Um, and when I was 23, um, I left Brooklyn and moved to Portland, Oregon. Um, and Up to that point, I'm an artist. That Up to that point, I generally worked in film and photography. Um, but increasingly, this is kind of just pre-video being really good and accessible. Um, my practice started to dematerialize because I just couldn't afford film anymore. But everything that I learned as a filmmaker, working, thinking about narrative, having a crew that was highly collaborative, um, all of those skills were still there, and I've always really been interested in how just kind of the properties of social life and how that is a space for learning. I know it played a huge role in my own education, just the frameworks that we set up for one another through experience, through individual knowledge, um, through our connection and relationship to one another. We create new forms of knowledge and new forms of learning from one another. Um, so that really started to change my practice in the early 2000s. Um, and for the last 25 years, my work has really kind of been at this intersection of um, social life and coeducation, but then specifically how we recognize power and how it moves, and then how we can move that around more equitably um, by being with one another, creating social spaces that are improvisational and experimental, and are rooted in um, like entanglement and collective knowledge.
what
Um,
does that mean in terms that are concrete that people can actually see?
yeah, so when I first started doing that and when I was living in Portland, it really was attached to kind of the contemporary art world. And I generally worked collaboratively. I had founded this group called Red 76. Um, and we got commissions from museums and whatnot, universities, smaller art spaces, and we were kind of going over all over the world. Um, but increasingly, in relation to those nodes that I talked about, like coeducation, sociality, and power. It's just like, we're kind of peripatetic looking for a check all the time. I believe in what we're trying to discuss with people. And I also think that there's a residue that's left from these projects that we're doing, but I'm constantly leaving home, and this work is most important in relation to my own life. Um, and it has its most power, I think, um, when it can work on its own time and it can grow uh, in a kind of consistent social landscape. So what that means in terms of being able to kind of see it or feel it um, really changes on where you do it and how long you do it for. So around 2014, I decided I need to figure out how to kind of get off this contemporary art bandwagon, and I gave myself this um, so-called limitation of doing the majority of my work within walking distance of my house. Um, to see what happens when over time these ideas go out and how they come back, how it can change the place that I live in, but also how it can change me. What sort of transformations take place when when you stick to a place
Mm.
and you stick to a people?
How do you get from there to where you are now in Indianapolis? I'm sorry, Minneapolis.
Um, well, that's kind of a tough question.
That's okay. We
In
got
that
time.
in that it's rooted so much in my life, and if you were thinking about it outside the idea of hey, as an artist, how did you get from here to here? Sure. But if it was, hey, as a human being, how did you get from here to here? It gets more complex because we allow for the complexity because we insist upon ourselves as complex beings. Um, it's so deeply ingrained with how I want to be living as a human being, what I think my responsibilities are as a neighbor, and what I think the possibilities are inherent with the idea of neighborliness as a kind of creative and critical practice, as a social practice. Um, so lots of things have changed. I know I operate a lot differently than like when I first said, like, I'm going to do all this work in my neighborhood. Um, I absolutely do things differently now. Um, I'm less insistent on the idea of now, um, and I'm more, uh, far more in tune with the idea of now being very elastic and everybody working on different time signatures and that there's a polyrhythm to life and we have to more so kind of tune ourselves into what that rhythm is than try to be on this martial beat.
Um, Sam, so one example of a community project you did was opening up the space in the old Sears building there in South
Yeah, yeah,
Minneapolis. This and I think I've seen like that same mall highlighted, with all the ICE stuff going on because
oh
it's
yeah,
made up of a lot of immigrant shop owners that are scared to go to work and all that. So
yeah.
can you talk just briefly about the space that you set up there and kind of what you learned about the community? And then if I remember correctly, kind of that was kind of what was going on when George Floyd hit or the pandemic hit and how that affected things as well.
Yeah, so that was about 5 years before George Floyd was murdered, just like 8 blocks away from there. So I live 2 blocks from the market. I'm kind of in between George Floyd Square and the Midtown Global Market. You're right. It's an old Sears complex. There are about 4 or 5 other replica buildings like that were these huge regional hubs for Sears that were built roughly about a century ago. There's one in Boyle Heights, there's one in Boston, and there's one in Memphis, and they look almost exactly the same.
Hmm.
And as global commerce has changed, these massive, massive complexes have gone fallow and then been repurposed. The one that's in our neighborhood, um, one of the key functions of at least the ground floor of this space is this public market. Um, and it's a lot of kind of uh, grassroots startup businesses, immigrant-run businesses, taquerias, pho, Vietnamese places. We have a very large Hmong population in the Twin Cities, um, and about the time that I was like, okay, I'm going to really focus on this neighborhood practice. I've always really been interested in publication and in expanded sense. So like I love books, I love zines, I love printing things, but I most importantly, I really love what they can do. I love that they highlight space in between people and pose questions and the possibility of some sort of bridge. Um, so I had been collecting print equipment for a while when Red 76 was still doing work um, primarily in the kind of contemporary art world. We always made publications And as I knew we were kind of going to get out of that, I started, instead of shopping out jobs to printers, taking that line item and buying equipment, knowing that that was kind of my escape hatch. Um, and I set up this little kind of print shop bookstore as a platform for neighborhood conversations, wherein in the middle of the market, people could come, there are books, we can print things for people, but there's also this big table, and people can come and sit and hang out and on their own time see what develops, and maybe they want to make something out of that. And then we can move that into the neighborhood and see how it comes back to us. So it was really an attempt to create this cyclical device using print and sociality as a social tool. Um, so uh, we opened that shop and really opened it in a way that I just thought was kind of a amazing framing device. Emory Douglas, who was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party and the designer and editor of the Black Panther, was in town. So Mr. Douglas and I had a conversation about kind of the social life of print, and print as publication as an act of public making to open the space that we called beyond repair, meaning moving past the rhetoric of people and places that need fixing. Um, and really kind of creating our own narratives rather than the narratives that are foisted upon neighborhoods like we live in. And that was the beginning in the shop. Um, and pretty soon after that, this guy, Dwaba Unenra, came in. I heard some things about it, didn't quite know what it was. And we wound up having a 3-hour long conversation, and have been collaborating with one another for the last 10 years. And Dwaba and I founded Confluence Studio, which is kind of our main focus over the last 5 years. And we founded it just just before, actually just before the pandemic, and then just before George Floyd was murdered up the block.
And what are you guys producing together? Like zines and or other writings, or what actually is coming out of the
Um, Confluence really is a way to be able to support relationships that can creatively and critically think about how um, the social infrastructure of neighborhoods is both as important and as attached to the material infrastructure of a neighborhood. So the way that we see one another, our culture, our shared cultures, the stories we tell, uh, the things that uh, qualitatively we can understand because we are of a place, um, are as important as your roads and your stoplights, um, your water mains, and the policies that we live with. All of these things are entangled with one another and inform one another. So we do a lot of the different things to kind of get people into that space. Um, and it's kind of changed over time. The publication side, at least for the last few years, has generally been very practical. Um, we really began in the like right after the uprising. I don't know how much people understand like how devastated the neighborhood was after the uprising. Huge amount of buildings along East Lake Street were destroyed. Um, and we serendipitously had been asked to do a, you know, so-called participatory development process at a building that had burned down 2 years prior, that had been really integral to the neighborhood and had really been like neighborhood run, not a nonprofit. It was just this space with artist studios and taquerias, a capoeira studio, and you've been there for decades and decades and decades. There was an electrical fire. Um, so we had this corner at East Lake in Chicago um, just down the street from where George Floyd was murdered. And we used that as this like open air lab for the entire summer. And one of the things that we did in that time period, we had all of our print equipment was in storage. We strangely we were donated a shipping container. Um, and we were talking with neighbors and we're like, hey, we have this shipping container. What should we do with it? And also we have all this print equipment. And we decided to rehab the shipping container and create this mobile media studio, which on site we rehabbed it. And the next spring, we have some friends who own a bookstore just down the alleyway from the former 3rd Precinct site where all the officers who murdered Floyd were stationed. So they invited us to be in their courtyard so we can move the print studio down the alley from the precinct, which to this day is still barricaded and shuttered,
Hmm.
so that we could have a space through our social life with one another to create a material history about our thoughts about what could come next, how we could live with one another in the shadow of the precinct. Um,
So,
yeah,
hey, I want to ask something just really much about this moment because you're talking about neighborhood infrastructure and how significant that is. How has
yeah.
ICE's presence this year disturbed the infrastructure? If you could give us some details on examples.
Um, It certainly has, uh, in terms of, it's just, like, devastating, it's harrowing, it's traumatic, but I kinda wanna flip that question a little bit in that the infrastructure that I'm alluding to, that social infrastructure, the reason people are paying attention to Minneapolis, because of how we're working with one another, how we're resisting, how robust and creative and caring, um and thoughtful it is because of that infrastructure. It's because of what we learned and did well and did not do well following the uprising. But furthermore, the generational knowledge specifically of South Minneapolis. Um, it's extremely important for everyone to ground their understanding of this neighborhood um,
Tell us
in
why.
the
Tell
fact,
us why. Why?
well, in 1968, in response to the institutional abuse of the Minneapolis Police Department towards Native people, the American Indian movement was founded in South Minneapolis.
Mhm.
Um, for over 50 years, and obviously well before that, this is a place of people arriving and living with one another and as best as possible, supporting one another. And that is a generational knowledge that is passed down both explicitly and unconsciously through uh, cultural co-creation. Um, and it changes and it adapts and it learns over time. And what people are seeing on social media, on the news, the way that we're responding
Mhm.
is us learning from one another and applying those tools against a mass federal militia attempting to eradicate what I would argue is the inevitable future of America, which is what our neighborhood looks like. It's people
Mhm.
of all races, ethnicities, multiple classes, varied political ideologies who are insisting on supporting one another and valuing the idea of, again, this idea of neighborliness, of
Mm.
what do we owe one another rather than what is owed me.
You know,
Uh,
I asked, I'm sorry, love. I just want to get this one out. I'll shut up.
Yeah.
I was saying to friends.